Well, Raleigh, thank you very much. I appreciate that rousing introduction. I particularly want to thank our sponsors, Cisco and Teradata. Without their support and contributions to this particular piece of research, it wouldn't be the expansive and very comprehensive study that it is today. So, want to talk a little bit about what we're going to have for the agenda for today's presentation. We're going to talk a little bit about the research highlights. We're going to talk about our survey respondents, or if you will, the demographics of the folks as part of our survey panel. We're going to look at the drivers of their IoT initiatives that they have in the works and how they're dealing with it. We feel that the use cases, devices, and champions are really important to what people are doing in terms of IoT, because without that use case, that driver to make your device information useful and a part of your business plan, you kind of are doing IoT for IoT's sake. The devices that the information is being pulled from is going to be one of the key components. After all, it is the Internet of Things, and the source information is really going to be important for that. And then the champions, the people who are driving those use cases to put them into their department's use and make them a strong part of what they're doing. In particular, we have 4 industries that we wanted to look at. We did so in the research. We felt that these industries would have some particular adoption of IoT, so they got some special sets of questions that went to them. And for the most part, we've been able to aggregate those up and kind of compare them across industries, but we decided not to ask the same questions of the healthcare industry that we did of the manufacturing industry. We're going to look at some of the real-world implementations through some of the projects. We're going to look at the security, because I think that's an important aspect of any data management or analytics project that is out there, is how do we secure this particular data. And then we're going to look at an architecture based on the results of the research, based on feedback directly from our respondents. We've put together, if you will, a reference architecture for IoT and how people want to look at that. And then finally, as Raleigh talked about, we'll be talking about the question and answer section of it. In terms of EMA's research methodology, we're always on the lookout for highly qualified respondents to be part of our survey panels. We're predominantly looking for individuals that are going to have visibility into the strategy, implementation, and budgets associated with the particular topics that we look at. And our study here today is no different. Our study is global in coverage. I'll detail that shortly. And we also go for a fine balance between business and IT, particularly when you look at the types of impacts to business models and business cases that come from the subject matter expertise in the business intelligence and analytics practice here at EMA. It's important to balance those two components. All right, we'll talk about the highlights. So the study that we're going to talk about today has 250 respondents. Again, they're balanced nicely, almost exactly 50% on each side for business and IT leaders from around the world. As part of that, they come from many different sizes of companies. Here at EMA, we define them as being enterprise companies being 5,000 headcount and above, large companies being between 500 and 5,000, and mid-size being those organizations that are 500 headcount and below. As part of this survey today, we have almost 31% of our respondents are in that enterprise class, so we've got a lot of the larger companies here. 41%, just a little bit over that, are from the large size of companies, and then our mid-size organizations represent about 28 to 29% of our respondent pool. So we definitely have a good mix of organizations in terms of their size, and we have an excellent mix of organizations in terms of how they're viewing their challenges from around the globe. We have almost 40% coming from North America, another 38% coming from the EMEA region, primarily from the EU in the UK, Germany, and France. We have a significant number of folks in the survey from the Asia-Pacific region, almost 21% of our respondents. And then we have a brief group of people from Central and Latin America, and we're excited to have them as part of the survey. But unfortunately, there's not enough of them to really give us a geographic breakdown by that particular component. But this gives you a sense of the global reach that we have in today's survey. In terms of the industry segmentation, we have many different industries that are assigned into our research organically. In this particular case, we asked to have, like I said, those 4 different groups of very specific industries. So we have almost 18% of our respondents coming from the manufacturing industry, another 13% coming from retail, almost 8.5% of our respondents coming from the healthcare industry, which I think is going to be very well served by the world of the Internet of Things. And then another 5% of our respondents coming from transportation. And I think that, one of the use cases we've heard quite a bit about is that connected vehicle, connected car, truck, plane, train. And that's, again, this is going to be an area that's going to be very important to that particular industry. And we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. In terms of the strategies and drivers, the people that were in the survey panel, those 250 respondents from around the globe, they were in fact asked to participate in a survey around Internet of Things strategies. So it's not surprising to see a significant number of our respondents saying they are adopting or above. But what I found to be rather interesting that we have nearly 70%, maybe a little bit over that number, saying that IoT strategies were essential or important to the way that they were doing business. If you add in the people that were also adopting, we have almost 85% of our respondents in these areas that are saying we are adopting IoT initiatives and the strategies that go with that, and they have been integrated into our business cases. So we feel very, very heartened to see the types of information that we're seeing here in the survey to say many organizations, when they are doing IoT, they're moving down that particular path, and they're trying to integrate it into the way they're doing that. I think it's because we've seen a lot of great examples of organizations that have been able to capture sensor data, and a lot of organizations are working towards the opportunity to match that type of performance in their businesses. In terms of the business reasons for establishing an IoT ecosystem or an IoT initiative, we found that 32% of our respondents are saying that they were looking for some form or fashion of process efficiency, and those are our top 2 answers. In particular, they're looking at an increase in product or service quality. So adding sensors to a particular product to say, how do we see how people are using these things? How can we help them make a better product? And how do we pull this information and have that go down? The second one is increasing customer satisfaction, what goes along with that customer service, customer quality. If we can figure out how people are using products and then either design in new features to make them happier, or perhaps even engage in some training to say that this is the proper way to use these particular products. Those are our top business reasons that go along with that. Our second major category is in that area of operational productivity. Being able to look at operational cost reduction or visibility and predictability into operational processes as we're creating those new products and services or increasing customer satisfaction. It's important for us to maintain our cost structures that go along with that. And as we look at these organizations, whether it be in healthcare and trying to reduce the overall cost of care, if we look at it in manufacturing, trying to maintain margins associated with assembly and production, these are 2 natural areas that be in the top 2 choices associated with those business benefits. In terms of the use cases, devices, and champions, we're definitely taking a look in these particular areas. And when we look at use cases, we're finding that organizations, much to the business benefits, are looking at the area of productivity and efficiency in their operations. Again, that light blue area that we just saw on screen, and then that improved customer self-service in terms of the use case that they're trying to use. So, for example, I happen to be wearing one of those neat accelerometer step trackers on my wrist, and there was a certain amount of consternation for me to get it up and running and getting it all set up. But once I started getting data off of it, I was going to get tips from the provider, and they would say, hey, are you sure you're doing these things? Are you sure you're doing those? And my satisfaction with that went up because it was looking at how I was using the device and how the data was flowing off of that. If they didn't have a sensor in that particular device and having it communicate back, I never would have gotten that particular feedback. In terms of the devices, as we look across all industries, we're seeing that plant equipment and infrastructure is our number 1 device as we look across all of these industry groups. And that's not surprising when we consider how we want to look at either if we are in say, a major office park, or, I happen to be talking to you today from a hotel, being able to put in intelligent thermostats, intelligent aspects on the elevator banks and things of that nature, that can help to lower our environmental costs, cooling in the summertime, heating in the wintertime, making sure that we've got the right elevators in the right places for people that we have on each floor. That helps to do both of those things that we've talked about in terms of increasing our operational efficiency and increasing that customer care aspect as well. In terms of the organizations that we're looking at here, in terms of who are the sponsors of these particular champions, we see that 32% of our respondents are coming from logistics and operations, again, looking at that operational efficiencies. 28.5% are coming from areas associated with upper management, general management. When we were talking about these concepts of raising revenues, lowering costs, increasing our margins, that grabs the attention of our CEOs, our CFOs, and then the information technology group. It's very important to be able to put these components together and to have them really work in tandem, because we've got a lot of moving parts all the way from the device to collecting the data from a particular point, being able to look at it in terms of an operational perspective. Are these devices operating the way we would like in our processes? Being able to pull that information back into a centralized location and be able to look across properties or geographies, and then finally bring it all the way back to our data center so that we can look at historical analysis and see what are the trends associated with this device operation. Are we seeing common elements across geographies, across products, across particular customer uses? In terms of our individual industries, some of the highlights associated with this, not surprisingly, the healthcare champions are patient care. Nearly 2 out of 10 of our respondents indicated from the healthcare industry that patient care was the main champion of their IoT initiatives. And when you think about the ability to put on biomedical devices, being able to use IoT to help with laboratory testing to lower the cost of healthcare in particular areas, these are all very important aspects. And it's heartening to see, at least for me, to see that the champions in the healthcare industry are those individuals that are looking directly at patient care. In terms of manufacturing, in terms of the devices, it's kind of interesting to see that, if we think about the manufacturing industry, we think about large, heavy equipment, we think about these particular aspects that are on a slower replacement cycle than we might see for consumer durable goods or some other particular areas. So the number one device for manufacturing happen to be identification devices like barcode or RFID scanners that would allow me to be able to, if I can't sensor my entire assembly area, let me be able to identify the amount of supplies that are coming in at the beginning of my manufacturing process, manage what is coming out of the backside of that manufacturing process, and continue down that path to where I can build up to a fully censored environment, including both my supplies and my manufacturing equipment. In terms of retail use cases, kind of interesting to see that they both relate around the handling of products. Now, granted, retail is all about moving products from point A to point B, but the number one consideration was how do they look at the way that product is being stored, particularly if we look at perishable products and we have to have a recall, whether it be fruit, whether it be packaged goods, things of that nature. That was the number one use case in terms of retail. The next one down was fraud prevention and fraud management, to make sure that they don't have inventory shrinkage and leakage in that area. So from that perspective, using RFID or barcoding to say, how do we make sure that the components that come into our stores, minus the spoilage if it is a perishable item, minus our sold goods, are at the lowest tolerances that we can possibly get in that area, and that's a considerable cost when you think about the realm of retail. In terms of transportation, it's not surprising to see the number one use cases being in terms of process efficiency and operations. If you think about the major expenses that go into just about any transportation industry, the two major ones are fuel and labor. And if you can figure out ways to put sensors on the trucks, trains, ships, containers, et cetera, that are associated with the transportation industry, and be able to figure out ways to minimize your fuel costs, reduce the number of hours that your drivers, pilots, captains are spending in those particular areas, that helps you to, one, reduce your fuel costs, two, improve the safety of your staff, and to lower the costs associated with those folks so that you can do more shipments with fewer resources. So this is not surprising to see a major component of the transportation use case. In terms of IoT projects, of our 250 respondents, we had information on over 700 different projects about what they're accomplishing, what they're doing with their IoT strategies and their initiatives. So this gives us a lot of real-world influence or visibility into what organizations are doing and how they are doing it. In terms of the number of projects based on individual respondents, we see that we have nearly 50% of our respondents, or a little bit over than that, have between 2 and 3 different projects associated with their IoT initiatives. This tells us that these organizations are continuing the path to say they didn't get scared off by their first project, and they're moving from their first to the second to the third. But it's also interesting to see that the number of people that have a single project is almost the same number of people who have 5 projects or more, which shows us that not only are people sticking their toe in the water, but they're continuing to move down the path and have new projects. And when they find that success, they continue to move in particular areas so they can continue. In terms of the project sponsors, the people who are footing the bills for those champions who are motivating them for these IoT initiatives, it's not surprising to me to see that IT and the data center role has got a significant amount of this budgetary sponsorship. But if you look at the next 4 of our top 5, they include sales, marketing, finance, customer care. If we go from 5 going on up, customer care really feeds into that. How do we improve our customer satisfaction? How do we improve the way that people are using our particular products? You look at finance, that goes to all of those use cases around how do we lower the amount of expenditure that we have, whether it's retail for fraud, whether it's fuel costs associated with the processes for transportation. You look in terms of marketing and sales, it's all about how do we improve the quality of our products so that we can make a greater splash and increase our revenues on the top end. So very interesting to see those 4 groups all being in our top 5. So it's not entirely dominated by the technology groups, but it is, in fact, giving a lot of business components into these areas. In terms of securing IoT, a lot of organizations, particularly when I ask questions relating to security in my end-user research, they provide me with feedback that says that security is paramount in what they're doing. I don't know if it's because they see the horror stories, if you will, about data breaches in the newspaper and on television, or whether it's they've got from firsthand knowledge that they've got breaches. But security and how organizations are handling the business of holding on to the data in their environments is very important, and IoT is no different. In terms of our direct IoT research here, we've got folks that are saying nearly 20% of the mentions saying enterprise-wide data protection policies are going to be the way that they're going to protect sensitive information in their IoT environments. Next one up is going to be how do they have segregated access based on roles and responsibilities within the organization. So really being able to take it to that next level of saying, no, we're not just going to collect all this data, but as our senior analysts need to take a look at information, whether it be from marketing, finance, data, operations, things of that nature, how do they have access to be able to see all the information that they need to see, whether it be all these areas? And because they become senior analysts, they have the trust of the organization and understand policies and procedures. Next layer down from that would be our junior analysts. You know, if we have someone who's relatively new to the organization, we don't quite have given them all the rules of the road, we don't necessarily want to share all of our social security and information such as that if we have personally identifiable information associated with our IoT environments. And we want to be able to mask or to somehow limit the access to that data. So a lot of times we'll mask all but the last 4 digits so that our junior analysts can do some level of identification but can't see that entire Social Security number or other personalized information. You're also going to see this quite a bit in terms of healthcare, where you see organizations where there are very strict regulations on who can and cannot see the data associated with a particular patient. A patient can obviously see all that information, the doctor can, but maybe a nurse or a nurse practitioner may not be able to see that. And then this way you can have those policies and procedures to say, based on your role, based on who you are, based on the particular data set that you want to see, we want to put those particular components together. In terms of the very specific concerns that people have around IoT in terms of security, the number one component goes a lot with what I've just been talking about, that loss of personal information. It's one thing, for example, like I said, I've got my accelerometer, pedometer that I have on my wrist that tracks my steps and tells me how far that I've gone. That information that comes off of that sensor really doesn't have a lot of value to it until we attach it to me, John Myers, and someone of my age, my gender, my height and weight, my activity level, and being able to protect that information for customers who are using devices is going to be paramount. The next stage up from that is the improper access to device and device operation. As we put out into the world all of these devices that are, quite frankly, wirelessly connected to either directly to the internet through Wi-Fi or other devices or other communications protocols, or more hardened devices that are connected to collection points, we want to make sure that we don't allow people to get access directly to the device if they want to be, somewhat malicious in terms of changing the configuration or altering some of the things that we want to do with those devices, or actually allowing the device to be operated by someone remotely. So those are 2 very specific IoT concerns that organizations have around what they're trying to do with their IoT security. In terms of IoT architecture, one of the things that I really wanted to look at when we designed this study was, what are the devices? What are people using? How are they bringing those things together? And as we looked at it, we kind of defined 2 different classes of IoT devices. On the one hand, we have something that I like to call an industrial device, something that is going to have limited access to power, connectivity, bandwidth, maybe operating in an environment much harsher than we might necessarily see in an office environment. So these types of things might be operating on oil wells, operating on say in a steel mill, areas where we're going to have adverse conditions. They're going to not have all the power in the world, so they have to conserve their energy and their electrical usage, and then also their access to bandwidth. If you're out in an oil field in North Dakota, you're not going to have the type of bandwidth that you might have if you're sitting under a 4G cell tower in a major metropolitan city. So you need to make sure that you are accounting for the types of information that come off of those industrial devices and how you're managing the electrical power for those. And because of that, you're going to see, I don't want to call it a cryptic, but you're going to see a much more sparse and, if you will, code-driven result sets that are coming off of these devices. And you're going to see the need those going to be augmented with information to say, not only is there a product code that's associated with this, but this is how we expand upon that product code. This is the situation code, and we might need to augment that with a more natural language presentation of that. On the opposite end of the spectrum are commercial IoT devices. And I put a thermostat on here because I think that the commercial or the consumer grade connected thermostat is a great example. This is something that sits in a room temperature environment, is generally connected directly to the power grid within your house, and is operating usually on whatever Wi-Fi equipment you have in your home. So you're talking about something that's got a very, if you will, in comparison to an industrial IoT device, a very easy life. It never gets too hot. It never gets too cold. It's got plenty of power. It's got plenty of bandwidth. And these types of devices can have greater levels of internal processing, memory, storage, things of that nature. They can, instead of sending a very cryptic or a code-driven message, they can be more expansive because they have more access to those particular components. So we feel these things are the main things that really drive into that. Now, industrial devices, they're going to need a collection point that will allow them, or an edge node, if you will, that allows the data to move from the device to that edge point, and from that edge point, it can now be aggregated, processed, filtered, et cetera, and we can do that. But we might need a little bit of help because those industrial devices are going to be a little bit more limited. The commercial devices may not need this level of communication. They might be able to go direct to a Wi-Fi and Wi-Fi out, or they might even be able to connect on their own. But these give you an idea of what are some of the characteristics associated with these particular devices. Now, when we look at this reference architecture diagram, as we have right here, you can see I have my commercial grade devices in the upper left-hand corner. You know, these are things like consumer durable goods. They're that consumer grade connected thermostat, things of that nature. You might also include biomedical devices that would operate in a hospital environment would be in this area as well. So basically, those are the types of things we see in that area, that commercial grade device. On the upper right-hand side, we see more of those industrial quality devices, ones that we might see, again, in a utility environment that are outside checking on how much electricity or natural gas are being used at a particular home. How do we see the particular devices on an oil rig or things of that nature? Connected vehicle, how are we connecting from the engine to the brakes to the location? All of these components would come together and communicate with an edge point that might be inside of the connected device, might be as we encounter an environment as, say, as a truck, as a way station, or as we come into a train yard or something of that nature that would allow us to transfer that data from the industrial or connected vehicle and move that into the area. Pretty much that's going to be connecting these things is going to be a streaming architecture. A lot of the use cases that we've seen in terms of our projects indicate that they need to see a quick or near real-time, very low latency type of processing. And the streaming architectures are the things that are going to be able to allow us to do that type of thing. So we can be able to stream that data in near real time or in relatively low latency from the devices or from the edge nodes and bring that into a common collection point. And a lot of these collection points are going to be based on either a geography. We might say, for a particular hospital, a particular manufacturing plant. If we're talking about connected car, we might be thinking about a particular city or metropolitan area where we're going to pull all that information together and see how those processes, whether they be operational or discovery-based or things of that nature, can be handled and looked at those individual areas. And then from those geographic or facility-based collection points, we're going to move through some traditional ETL or data integration practices and bring them back to our data center. One of the questions that we asked as part of our research is, are you only doing things for operational considerations that would have it in that regional collection point or above? And we found that only about 3% of our respondents were saying they were only doing that. So we had 97% of our respondents who are moving downstream from those regional collection points into a more of a historical data management storage platform that would allow us to look at historical averages, look at trends across multiple geographies, allow us to do those types of things that would allow us to cluster activities as the people are using devices and things of that nature. And a lot of this is going into the concept, if you've been following the EMA analytics practice here for a couple of years, into that hybrid data ecosystem, whether it be a traditional enterprise data warehouse, a NoSQL platform, a Hadoop platform, maybe a different type of discovery platform that will allow you to bring that data together. And at this point, we now have all of those particular aspects that we can do. We can now have information about how a device is operating today, right now, in real time at that top layer. We can then communicate that to show how does that information, how does that device relate into a particular process by factory, by city, if we're talking about connected car, et cetera. And then how do we move it down to that historical level where we can either do data discovery, where we can, if we don't know the problem we're looking for, we can kind of stick our fingers in the data, pull it apart, look in different directions, do some exploration, or even move it into an area where we're doing machine learning, where we can do that clustering, where we can do that type of pattern matching so that we can identify policies and procedures and allow us to put that information back into the devices. But this gives us that whole range of from all the way from data creation, data collection, aggregation, and then finally into historical analysis. So this gives us this really strong basis of a frame of reference architecture that we have that's been validated, frankly, by the folks who are in the study. So in terms of this, where do we go from here? To be quite honest, I believe that the concept of IoT has arrived. We have a lot of organizations that are doing this. They're starting to put sensors out into their environments, whether it be it's short-term solutions, whether we're talking about barcode or RFID readers that would allow them to make a lower cost of commitment into their implementation, or whether they're starting to replace plant and equipment that would allow them to fully sensor into those areas and get very fine-grained details around what they're doing in terms of research for process orientation and operational information. Frankly, I'd say that IoT practices and patterns are still evolving. This is still a very, I wouldn't call it nascent, but it's it's a practice that is coming together. Organizations are trying to figure out how do we find the right way to do things? How do we find the right best practices? I've talked with a couple of organizations that have said we don't even know the questions to ask. So a lot of times they're reaching out to organizations that have knowledge across from the generation to the collection to the analytics of these particular data sources and saying, hey, how can we get some help in these areas and really setting best practices? So I think we're working through that. And then I think the analytics are very important. I've said this a number of times, both today and at other venues, that the analytics and the use of this data is probably the most important aspect of the Internet of Things. Merely putting a sensor on a car, a truck, a wristwatch to track steps, that's all well and good, but until I'm able to put that into a particular context to say, this vehicle is operating outside of particular norms, putting this biomedical information on this patient is showing that, yes, they're doing fine or they're starting to trend out of where we would like them to be in that regard. That is very important to put that type of context around it. Then to be able to say, how are we looking at this in terms of a greater community of information to say, are all the cars, are having an issue and we're starting to find an issue with either gridlock in the way that our traffic flows go or a traffic jam due to an accident. In connected vehicles for transportation, we're looking for the most logical way and optimized way to put these things together so that we can have good flowing rail traffic. We can have smooth running airports and shipping. This all comes together. And then as we move down the path, we can start to get into those advanced analytical techniques to be able to identify classes of devices that operate well, classes of devices that operate poorly, start to investigate why are the classes of devices that aren't operating as well doing so, and quite frankly, the ones that are operating well, to be able to bring that together as well. So we're looking at that whole gamut. It's not just being able to say, hey, this device moved from point A to point B. It's to be able to put it in that context and be able to say, how is this operating within the stretches of our organization? So at this point, I'm going to hand it back over to Raleigh, and she's going to start queuing up some of the questions that you guys have provided in terms of Q&A. But Raleigh, I want to hand it back to you.
Great. Thank you, John. There are two ways you can log questions. You can use the WebEx Q&A. Again, you can also send John a tweet. His handle is on this screen. John, I'm going to go ahead and jump into the questions. The first is, authentication and validation of devices was mentioned with regards to access control. Was there any indication among your sample group on the level of awareness for the need of device credentialing and what this entails?
Well, you know, I honestly want to say I considered going down to that level of really getting into that, and I realized that, you know, when we get down into that area, we're going to run into a problem associated with the depth of knowledge with some of the folks that we're talking about. So I would have loved to have gone down to that particular level, but I really felt that if I did that, we might be going too far down. So I'm afraid I do not have answers on that. But what we do have is that people are very concerned about how they're doing that, and they're going to be looking for solutions that allow them to manage access into those devices. I think we're going to find many of the patterns that we have seen in terms of access to, say, smartphones or other remote devices that we have either in the office or in an industrial area, and we're going to take those patterns and we're going to try to apply them either to a commercial device or down to the industrial device level.
Thanks, John. This attendee wants to know, what about wearables? Did any of your research cover this?
Yes, we did. We got a considerable amount of information about wearables in the healthcare field and other areas. I think that one of the great opportunities, if we start just from the healthcare side to be able to use wearables, is to say, you know, can we allow our patients that what we used to use an ICU unit or a hospital bed environment to monitor and manage that? Can we put a biomedical device on somebody, a wearable, if you will, send them home, have them operate in their home environment without having to be admitted into the hospital and all the stresses that go with that? You know, I've talked with physicians that have said one of the most stressful things in the world is to be admitted to the hospital. And if you're trying to do any type of cardio or cardiac monitoring, you kind of exasperate the problem. So you're almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. And being able to allow people to be in their own home for those tests and monitoring can really help folks. And a burgeoning area, if you take wearables and connect them with geolocation information, you start to really get into the concept of we can now start to really evaluate what's going on our job sites and what is going on in particular areas. And people noticed on one of the slides back farther in the process, you saw that human resources was one of the areas that was kind of a big sponsor that went into some of these projects. And where they're going is saying, hey, let's put on a biomedical device or receiver on a safety vest that we oftentimes we see people wearing at construction sites or during our big mass transit production processes or production sites. Put a GPS in there, put maybe a heart monitor, and put a body temperature. So if you're doing work in the summertime in a very hot condition, you can start to monitor your employees for safety reasons around health, around their health. You know, let's make sure we don't have anybody who has not frostbite, but heat stroke, and look for those sensors. In terms of geolocation, we can look around a job site and be able to provide information about where people are during a given point in time. If we have an incident, we no longer have to ask people, where were you, what did you see, that type of stuff. You can now say, this is where everybody was on the construction site, and be able to use that in those particular areas. I think one of the leading industries for this type of monitoring, management, and safety is going to be the mining industry, which has already done extensive work due to regulation to make sure that, you know, when there is an incident in the mine, you have information about where your miners are, where the equipment is. We can take those best patterns as we see the device costs come down, and we can use that at the job site maybe even in a retail location to understand how many clerks do we need on a given floor, where can we position them so we have the most coverage. So I definitely think that wearables are going to come in for both healthcare, retail, manufacturing, construction, areas like that.
Thanks, John. Staying in that vein, this attendee has a question specifically regarding insurance.
Okay.
He asked, has there been insurance companies that would include the analytics from IoT data to help reduce the risk as well as the insurance premiums?
Well, I think one of the more pervasive ones in the United States is what a company called Progressive is doing with their Snapshot. They're able to do a more real-time insurance management of that. One of the issues of when you do something like a snapshot, you need to be able to get the data off of the car and get it to particular areas. So I'm seeing insurance companies that are exploring those areas. I think the hurdle in that is going to be the communication off of the vehicle to an insurance company. And the question might be, in addition to me having that savings on my insurance, do I want to pay for a data plan that's associated with my vehicle? I'm seeing organizations like major telecommunications companies that are saying, hey, let's put something like that, that you might replace the rear view mirror in your car and be able to feed data off of that and provide that information. But I think we're still at that data collection stage, so I think Snapshot is probably the best example of it from an insurance perspective. But I'm also hearing about organizations that are saying, let's put a camera in the car of a youth driver, and if we find an acceleration or a deceleration event that is outside of what we consider our normal areas, how can we get ideas about what's going on inside the car? I had a friend of mine with his teenage daughter. Oftentimes he would get a little picture or a little video that would be sent to him by that camera that would, where his daughter would be going, it was a cat. I didn't run over a cat. So I don't know if she was spending more time paying attention to the camera or paying attention to the road, but there's that type of information. So we're seeing those use cases, but I don't think we're quite at that real-time monitoring and rating for insurance at this point in time.
Thanks for that clarification, John. The next question is, given the volume of data that IoT projects have the potential to generate, did you get a sense from the respondents if they're looking to cloud platforms to collect, store, and provide advanced analytics to make sense of all their data?
Yeah, we are seeing that organizations are doing that. We saw a significant number of our folks saying that they had over 50% of their data associated with a cloud implementation. These cloud implementations can either be private, which would be inside their own data center, so they have that flexibility. It could be public resources like we might find from one of the major cloud storage providers, or a hybrid of those two, where we might have our personally identifiable information residing in our private cloud environments, and we would have our non-personally identifiable information that would exist outside. But I think the cloud offers a good opportunity for this, but I don't think that we have people saying one way or the other, I'm going to go cloud or I'm going to go inside of my data center, but we are seeing that information being reflected in the results.
Great, thank you. This audience member wants to know if the driverless car concept is related to IoT.
Oh, most certainly the driverless car concept is related to IoT. You might consider it to be an autonomous component where you might say, hey, a driverless car is all by itself and it's not sending data back. But I think that as we start to get more driverless vehicles and we want to start having them operate not necessarily as a collective, because now it's starting to sound like a Star Trek episode, but in concert. So if we have multiple driverless cars in the same environment, they need to be able to communicate with each other to say, hey, we've got road congestion, we've got issues with the roadway itself, whether it be potholes or snow or rain or things of that nature. So they are going to be talking to each other. So yes, connected car is definitely part of IoT. There are parts of it where you might have the data being shared at a higher latency than others, but as we continue down the path of driverless car, we will see more of those real-time IoT connections with those vehicles.
Great, thank you. Can you talk about security best practices for IoT?
So yes, we have some of this information in the study. And in terms of best practices, a lot of them are going to be similar patterns to the ones that we currently use with our data management practices. So imagine, if you will, when we say, hey, we're going to have access to a data store, and we're going to do that by user and group and things of that nature, we're going to extend those patterns out to the device layer. But because we're going to have lots of little data sources, it's going to be a much higher level of access and manipulation that we're going to need to have with that. So you're probably going to see, rather than a best practice where we manage on a source-by-source environment that we might do in a data center or in an office environment, we are going to need to go to much more to a policy management perspective, much in the way that we update software and policies, say, on mobile devices, or being able to push that out. So we're going to see a lot of the best practices and patterns come from the device management field that we are seeing in terms of mobile devices, networks, things of that nature. So that's where a lot of those best patterns will come from, and we'll have to adjust them slightly for the device domain that we're talking about.
Thank you, John. This audience member has a public utilities question. We'll see if you have an answer for it or not. Have you seen a rise in projects by public utilities to update or replace older PLC systems with more secure and less hackable IoT sensors and transceivers?
I do not have visibility into that. I do know that as we are putting greater levels of renewable energy generation in our energy grids, we are updating both the demand side, the meters, if you will, and the generation side, because if you have a lot of demand and your generation side, say, whether it be on a cloudy day for solar or a calm day for wind, and they don't quite match up, you're going to have to find alternative ways to have that come together. So I would say that the big driver at this time would be to upgrade those generation and demand points by when we have greater and greater renewable resource generation on the grid. So that would be my main driver in that particular area, but I don't have direct information in the study about how that would be addressed in the utilities industry.
Okay, thank you. This audience member wants to know, are you aware of a specific story from your interviews that may shed light on new end customer insights that companies are getting from their IoT projects that would not have existed before their IoT strategies, especially something that could yield new sources of competitive advantage?
Well, yeah, I do. I am a huge fan of something called the Wilson X basketball. The Wilson Sporting Goods Company has figured out a way to hang a sensor that can talk to your smartphone in the middle of a basketball and have it not alter the spin and bounce associated with that particular device. So now at this point, the folks at Wilson have gone from the opportunity to say, hey, we make and ship basketballs, and those basketballs are sold at particular places, and you kind of, get lost in the shuffle, if you will, in your relationship with the end customer, to the point where they not only know, hi, I've sold this basketball, serial number 127, to someone like John Myers, and John uses it 3 times a week at the Lafayette Rec Center in East Boulder County. He usually plays for about a half an hour, 45 minutes at a time, and he is a bad dribbler and a bad shooter, but he's been getting better since he started tracking his progress on our app. And that sporting goods retailer has gone from, we make lots of basketballs and we ship them, to now they can have a direct relationship with that individual customer. And they're getting information about that customer. They're getting information about the usage. They're able to get information about, are there other Wilson X basketballs around me? Am I influencing people by having them come? Have I been influenced by somebody else with that Wilson X? And all of this information has now changed fundamentally the potential of the business relationship between a sporting goods manufacturer and the end consumer of that piece of sporting goods. And I think that's a great opportunity. I'm also, a big fan of the pedometer that's on my wrist, and it talks to my phone, and my phone talks to their big system in the sky, and it says, hey, you might want to do a few more steps today, or you may want to have a few less French fries and things of that nature. And that has really gone to the point where rather than just counting steps, we're now counting steps in coordination with calorie consumption and things of that nature. And again, you're changing that relationship to selling a commodity good to having a relationship between those manufacturers and the end consumers.
Those are great examples, John. Thank you for sharing those. And I wanted to thank the audience for all the great questions that came in. You will be receiving a follow-up email from EMA tomorrow. It will include the on-demand playback of today's event and some additional resources. The full report will be available in June. I will send out an email notifying you when it is available. Thanks for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day.